Welcome back. You're watching Your World at 10. Now, what started in Tunisia has now spread like wildfire to the rest of the Middle East and North Africa. And while regimes have been toppled in both Tunisia and Egypt, what will be the outcome of this spring of discontent in, let's say, Libya, Bahrain, Algeria, Morocco, Yemen, Jordan, Djibouti and Syria? Well, to give us a political view, we're joined by Edward Bell. He's the Deputy Editor of the Middle East and North Africa for the Economist's Intelligence Unit. And joining us on the line with his observations on the economic and business impact is Shankar. He's the CEO of Europe, Middle East, Africa and Americas at Standard Chartered Bank. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me. Edward, if I may start with you, we're now entering the 9th day of standoff and protests in Libya. Contrast for me how you think Libya or the outcome of Libya's protests will be, with regards to or in comparison to the kind of change in regime that we're anticipating in Tunisia and Egypt.
Well, the case of Libya is quite different because there's less of a popular support for that regime than you had in either country. So what we're seeing in Libya at the moment is a prospect for, unfortunately, some pretty hairy conditions and probably increased violence throughout the country. You could have a case where essentially Libya is almost split into two, where you have one side, the east, which has generally been more resistant to the rule of Muammar Gaddafi, Libya's ruler, and his area sort of centered around Tripoli, the capital.
Edward, how then do you expect Libya's protests to end, if at all? What kind of outcome can we expect from Libya? And what does that mean for the kind of protests and unrest that we've been seeing across the region, the list of countries that I've already put out in the introduction?
Yeah, well, in Libya, again, we may have the situation where you have almost something approaching something like a civil war, and you have sort of two camps, one sort of against the regime and then the regime doing everything it can to stay in power. So literally, Gaddafi was saying yesterday he was going to fight to the last man, and we feel that's a pretty credible threat. So the stakes are fairly high in Libya. What that could mean is that you may have the case where you need to have some sort of international intervention to protect the stake of people in Libya throughout the country. So I don't think you're necessarily going to have the kind of democratic come down that you had in a place like Egypt or in Tunisia, where Mubarak or Ben Ali succumbed to popular pressure to step down eventually. I don't think Gaddafi feels he has that kind of pressure from the populace on him.
And what do you expect the protests to yield in, let's say, Bahrain or in Yemen or in fact even in Algeria or Djibouti?
Yeah, well, in Bahrain already you've seen some concessions from the king. Early this morning or last night he released about 25 political prisoners, many of whom had been arraigned or who had been put in captivity before the election last year. So I would expect in Bahrain there to be some more piecemeal concessions from the government. I don't think the protesters at this stage are ready to enter into a dialogue. They're probably going to hold out as long as possible and see how much they can get out of the king. But I see there would be scope for some more concrete kind of negotiation and dialogue going forward. Similar, I would say, is the case in Algeria, where the government yesterday ended the state of emergency that's been in place for over 20 years. So again, you're going to have the government trying to do everything it can to meet the protesters halfway. Likely you're going to have protesters, again, not wanting to compromise or not really wanting to dialogue with the political institutions, with the state, so somewhat of a deadlock, but again, you're probably going to have a bit more of a compromise negotiation there. In a case like Yemen, it's much, much harder because the government is there in power. It's not just dealing with these sort of social, economic demands. It is in the middle of a war, fighting against terrorism in the country. So I would expect there to be fewer political concessions in a case like Yemen.
Shankar, similar protests, similar uprisings, but potentially very different outcomes, and maybe we won't see the kind of positive outcome that we've seen maybe in Tunisia or Egypt, or hopefully a transition from military power to democracy over the next several months. We may not see that in several of the other countries where we are seeing protests. What do you make of the impact of this instability in the region on both the economy of the region as well as business?
I think, Menaka, two or three things. One, within the region itself, you could see a fall off, particularly in countries which are witnessing these protests, a fall in retail, travel and tourism, and in fact on regional trade. But equally, with the oil price going higher, some of the oil producers like Saudi and Abu Dhabi actually stand to gain. So there will be winners and losers even within the region. And again, another factor within the region is the flight to safety. So places like Dubai end up actually gaining as people move money and assets from troubled countries to places like Dubai, which are viewed as safe destinations. But also, we need to remember that as a result of particularly the turmoil in Libya, which is an oil producer, and oil prices spiking, there could be impact even outside the region in places like Asia, where you could have more inflationary pressure with fuel prices going up, because higher oil hurts consumers and growth and fans inflation, and also pushes up chemicals and plastic prices, but by adding to distribution costs actually aggravates food inflation. And the third impact of this is really what we are witnessing is investors rethinking emerging markets risk and potentially putting their money into so-called safe havens, Western equities, the US dollar, and less bad investments, if you will, like gilts and treasuries.
Shankar, what are your business clients telling you with regards to how much time they're giving to see how events unfold? Because it's very difficult to assess where each of these individual protest movements will end and how they will end and what the resultant outcome will be. So what does it mean for, let's say, businesses in other countries, businesses in Europe, businesses across Asia that do business with these regional entities? How do they expect timelines to change? Are they pulling back investments? You spoke of flight to safety. Are they rethinking investments in the region?
I think it's too early to say that they are rethinking investments, but clearly they are pausing to reflect and waiting for the fog to clear. Nobody knows how long this is going to last. People hope for the best. And clearly in places like Egypt, where there are institutions like the military and other institutions to take over and provide some semblance of stability, things are likely to return to normalcy faster than in a situation like Libya that Edward spoke about.
All right, let me come back to you, Edward, on how you assess the kind of international response or intervention that you're seeing in several of these protest movements that you believe will need international intervention or assistance to help resolve peacefully. For instance, you spoke of Libya and you said that we could expect that there might be need for stronger international intervention. How do you think the West is viewing what's going on here? Because for several decades, several of these leaders, authoritarian regimes, have had tacit approval of the West, have done business with the West. So what do you make of where the assistance is going to come from and what it's going to mean?
Yeah, that's right. I think the Western powers, whether it be the United States, France, or the UK, EU in general, they have greater leverage over some of the countries that have already experienced this kind of protest. So, for instance, in Bahrain, the US and the UK have pretty big influence there. There's a major US naval base. So, if the US puts pressure on the Bahraini government to improve its democratic credentials and make more concessions to the protesters, there you might, Western pressure might have some pretty tangible effects. In a country like Libya, there isn't the same kind of international leverage because Libya was so isolated for so many years and really has only come sort of into the been reintroduced into the international community in the past 10 years or so. There isn't really the kind of leverage from the Americans or from the Europeans that they have on some of the other countries. So what we had yesterday was a press statement from the UN calling for basically deploring the conditions going on in Libya at this time. It's likely you're going to get stronger worded statements coming out of the UN, and the potential is that you have a reimposition of sanctions on Libya again, which would certainly damage the economy there. It's a major oil exporter. It's going to hurt people, particularly in Europe. It's a big exporter to places like Spain, Italy, Germany. So there could be a lot of international pressure, but again, it may not have much traction on Gaddafi.
What's the worst case scenario we're looking at, not just for Libya, Edward, but for across the region? Do you expect this instability to last, let's say, a better part of this year, and therefore stymie any form of investment or economic recovery in any of these countries?
Well, across the region, yeah, you might have investors being a little bit spooked by the kind of unrest going on throughout the countries. Worst case scenario is that this kind of unrest continues and it boils over into sort of outright violence like what we've seen in Libya. However, I would not say that that is a likely scenario. We've already had protests in Jordan, in Morocco. There have been protests in Algeria, but they haven't had the same kind of violence that what we've seen, sort of basically running street battles like we've seen in Libya. So I think it may be time for investors to sort of adjust and accept that, okay, these protests are going to continue on. It may disrupt sort of the flow of investment decisions, but it may not make those markets any less attractive. And in fact, if the governments make some concessions and include more political opposition groups, it may just improve the opportunities for investors to invest in countries that are not seen as despots or authoritarian.
Shankar, what's the worst case scenario you're building into your assessment of this?
I think as these countries develop their democratic credentials, you should expect to see more protests and agitations. It's going to become the new normal. So I don't think necessarily you should get spooked by it. That should become almost business as usual. I do think that particularly the countries which have got proper institutions to manage this transition, if you will bounce back pretty quickly. But if they don't, I think we live in a very interconnected, globalized world, and the impact is not just going to be on the region, but it could drag the global economic recovery.
Absolutely, we're seeing that on